Casually explained, passive-aggressive people. A passive-aggressive statement rarely contains anything objectively offensive, yet it still manages to feel like something is slightly wrong. And the strange part is how reliably the brain detects hostility, even when the words themselves remain technically polite. And that mismatch between language and intent is exactly where the mechanism begins. By 2026, passive aggression is no longer just a personality quirk. It is a communication strategy built on indirect signaling, emotional ambiguity, and controlled deniability, where meaning is carried less by words and more by tone, timing, and selective omission. What most explanations get wrong is assuming it is about anger expression. It is not. It is about risk-managed hostility, where direct confrontation is replaced by socially safe signal distortion that allows emotional discharge without accountability. And this is where psychology starts to break down. Because direct communication has a cost. It forces clarity, commitment, and potential conflict resolution. Passive aggression avoids that cost entirely by embedding intent into ambiguity, allowing the speaker to maintain plausible deniability while still transmitting dissatisfaction. But what makes this even more unusual is how easily the brain reconstructs meaning from incomplete signals. A delayed reply, a neutral "okay," or an overly formal response can all be interpreted as negative depending on context, prior expectations, and emotional priming. And this detail changes everything. Because once interpretation becomes subjective, communication stops being about content and starts being about inference. The receiver is now doing the emotional labor of decoding intent, often filling gaps with their own assumptions rather than explicit evidence, which leads to a far darker mechanism. Passive aggression functions as low-grade social pressure without explicit escalation. It uses ambiguity as leverage, forcing the other person into uncertainty states where they continuously reassess whether they did something wrong, even in the absence of clear information. And researchers notice something unexpected. Uncertainty is more cognitively exhausting than direct conflict. The brain prefers resolution, even negative resolution, over unresolved ambiguity, which makes indirect hostility surprisingly persistent. This is where cognitive dissonance quietly accumulates. Because the target of passive aggression often holds two competing interpretations simultaneously, nothing is wrong, and something is definitely wrong. Those two states cannot stabilize, so the mind repeatedly cycles through scenarios to reduce uncertainty. But what makes this even more unusual is how passive-aggressive communication thrives on social constraints. In environments where direct confrontation is discouraged, workplaces, family systems, formal relationships, indirect expression becomes the default outlet for frustration. And this detail changes everything, because the system rewards politeness on the surface while allowing emotional leakage underneath. So, people learn to encode hostility into socially acceptable formats: overly formal messages, delayed responses, minimal effort compliance, or exaggerated politeness that signals dissatisfaction without explicit accusation, which leads to escalation dynamics. Over time, both parties begin operating on inferred meaning rather than stated meaning. Conversations become layered with subtext, where each interaction is evaluated not for what is said, but for what is omitted, delayed, or softened. And this creates a feedback loop where ambiguity increases sensitivity, and increased sensitivity produces even more ambiguity. But what makes this even more unusual is how social proof influences interpretation. If others in a group react similarly to subtle cues, those cues gain perceived validity. A neutral message becomes cold, not because of content, but because group interpretation assigns it emotional weight. And this detail changes everything again, because now meaning is no longer private. It is collectively constructed through repeated interpretation patterns, which means passive aggression can scale socially without ever being explicitly defined, which leads to a subtle authority shift. The person who communicates indirectly often gains control over emotional framing because they are never forced into explicit statements that can be challenged. The other party is left responding to interpretations rather than claims, which structurally weakens their position in the interaction. And researchers notice something even more counterintuitive. Passive-aggressive behavior is often reinforced unintentionally. When indirect signals successfully produce behavioral change without confrontation, the brain registers it as effective strategy, increasing future reliance on the same method. This is where habit formation enters social dynamics. Because once indirect expression works, it replaces direct communication in future conflicts. Over time, emotional honesty gets downgraded in favor of safer ambiguity, even when it reduces clarity and increases long-term misunderstanding. But what makes this even more unusual is how memory distorts these interactions afterward. People rarely remember the exact words. They remember the emotional impression, which means tone-based ambiguity becomes more influential than factual content in retrospective judgment. And this detail changes everything, again, because the conflict is no longer anchored in what happened, but in how it felt to interpret what might have happened. That shift makes resolution difficult, because there is no stable factual baseline to return to, which leads to the final layer. Passive aggression is not just about expressing anger indirectly. It is a system of communication that converts emotional discomfort into interpretive labor, transferring uncertainty from sender to receiver while maintaining outward social acceptability. And once that structure becomes normalized, even neutral communication can start to feel loaded, because the mind has already been trained to search for hidden meaning where none may exist. So the real question is not why people use passive aggression. It is how many everyday interactions are already running on the assumption that nothing means exactly what it says, and whether clarity is even socially profitable anymore, in a system that rewards ambiguity more than truth. And somewhere in that gap between what was said and what was meant, the conversation continues anyway, carefully, politely, and just vague enough to keep both sides slightly unsure. So yeah, like and subscribe. And I hope that okay wasn't actually about this video.